Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Eve Samples, Executive Director at Friends of the Everglades. Welcome to our monthly clean water conversation. We're grateful to everyone who's joining us live, taking the time out of your busy day to tune in on a very important topic at hand. And the topic today is whether Florida is doing enough to address the blue-green algae crisis, or whether we're failing in our response to that crisis that was so visible across the state really in 2018 and 2016. So I'm going to introduce our guests in a moment, but first I want to say that Friends of the Everglades hosts these events every month as a way to help you understand what can be really complex, in the weeds water policy issues. We invite people who know a lot about these issues and know how to explain them, which is certainly the case with our guests today. And we bring these to you free thanks to our sponsors, Conservation Wealth Management, and then the support of our grassroots donors. So we're very grateful for that. Without further ado, I want to introduce our guests. First, we have Haley Busch, who is with 1,000 Friends of Florida. She's the outreach director there and helps to promote a more sustainable future through collaboration with other organizations. And we are honored to be one of the organizations that 1,000 Friends collaborates with. Welcome, Haley.
Thank you.
Next, we have Jen Lomberk. Jen is an attorney by training and has used her legal background and policy knowledge to create change in her role as Matanzas Riverkeeper. Jen has done really great work on the topic at hand today, which is blue-green algae and tracking the Blue-Green Algae Task Force. Welcome, Jen.
Happy to be here.
Thanks. And Gil, last but not least, Gil is our policy director at Friends of the Everglades. He actually wears multiple hats, but the hat he has on today is as policy director. Welcome, Gil. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to just tee up this discussion and we'll talk for about 40 minutes or so. And we'd love to hear questions from the audience. If you're watching on Facebook or on YouTube, you can type questions or comments in the chat, and we'll get to as many of those as we can in the last 15 or 20 minutes. But to begin with, many of us who track water issues across the state of Florida vividly recall what happened in 2018 and 2016, and at least in the Stewart area of Florida in 2013, when highly visible, highly toxic blue-green algae, cyanobacteria, bloomed in our waterways. This is not a problem that's unique to Florida, but because of Florida's many challenges in terms of water management and water pollution, and the length of time during which those challenges have gone largely unaddressed and made worse in some ways, the problem in Florida really reached a visibility level and a crisis level that we hadn't seen before, especially in 2018 when it was affecting both sides of the state. Just speaking from personal experience where we sit in Stewart, Florida with Friends of the Everglades, I remember that kids couldn't go to summer camps in the water in 2018. Kids who went to environmental camps were going bowling instead because you literally couldn't come in contact with the water. So I'm just going to cue up a few pictures to refresh everyone's memory now. This is the St. Lucie River in 2018, and this was not an anomaly. During parts of that summer, the river was bright green with blue-green algae blooms, cyanobacteria. And this is actually from last September along the St. Johns River in the Jacksonville area. So although the estuaries that are connected to Lake Okeechobee, the St. Lucie and Caloosahatchee estuaries, really get blasted with blue-green algae, it's certainly not unique to those water bodies. St. Johns River has really struggled with the problem as well. And finally, I have a picture here of the Caloosahatchee estuary. The volunteer pilot, Ralph Artwood, has done a great job over the years documenting the blue-green algae problem there. So I'll turn back to kind of teeing this up now, and we can take the pictures down. Thank you, Allie. Allie's behind the scenes manning our visuals. And I just, want to point out that this isn't just an aesthetic issue. It looks terrible. It smells terrible. If you've ever been around blue-green algae, this is a public health crisis. We know that blue-green algae, cyanobacteria, is linked to neurodegenerative diseases. It's also linked to respiratory issues, digestive, gastrointestinal issues, and the research has been accumulating. Luckily, we're seeing more research being done on the harmful effects of toxic algae, and in particular blue-green algae. So that's the background on the topic at hand today. And in response to the 2018 toxic algae blooms, Governor Ron DeSantis addressed this on the campaign trail. And after getting elected in 2019, one of his first orders of business was creation of the Blue-Green Algae Task Force. This task force includes really highly regarded scientists, researchers, experts on algae, harmful algal blooms, including blue-green algae. They come from Harbor Branch Oceanographic, Smithsonian, FIU, other institutions. And that task force started meeting and came up with some actually pretty sound recommendations in late 2019. So it's 3 years later. Haley, Jen, Gil, and I are going to talk about what's become of those recommendations, whether the state of Florida has done enough, and where it hasn't. And spoiler alert, it hasn't in many cases. We're going to talk about what can be done. So Jen, I'm going to start with you. I referred to the consensus document that was published in 2019 by the Blue-Green Algae Task Force. Can you tell us a little bit about what was in that document? An overview of what categories they tackled and what areas were targeted for reforms?
Yeah, sure. Happy to kick us off. So the consensus document that they issued, it's fairly easy reading. It's very accessible if anybody wants to check it out. But the way that it's structured is it's broken down into 8 sections. And some of the sections are focused on a specific source of nutrient pollution, things like agriculture or septic or wastewater treatment plants. And then some of the sections are focused on broader concepts, things like public health and water quality monitoring. But basically, the document acknowledges that there are a lot of issues in a lot of areas where our water quality regulatory system is failing. And some of the recommendations were fairly specific, like these rules need to be updated to address X, Y, and Z. And then some of the recommendations were very broad, things like we need increased funding for certain programs, or we need increased water quality monitoring. And as somebody who works in the environmental space and has for several years, I was actually really excited to hear these experts, these appointed scientists, make a lot of the observations and recommendations that environmental groups have been advocating for years. But like you said, at the end of the day, a report or a consensus document in this case, it's not worth the paper it's written on if it isn't influencing policy, if these recommendations aren't being implemented. And so that's kind of what brings us here today.
Thanks, Jen. And I'll ask you a follow-up, and then I'm going to ask Haley to piggyback on it. So going through these recommendations in 8 different categories, how many of them have been implemented, and which ones have been most visibly or egregiously ignored?
So the short answer, like you said, spoiler alert, is that most of them haven't been fully implemented. Some of them have been initiated and some of them have had some money thrown at them at this point. But overall, it really just represents a very small step in what is going to be a pretty big undertaking. And there are a couple of recommendations where just no progress has been made at all. So I am sure a lot of the people tuning in today are kind of familiar with BMAPs. They understand, but for those of you that might not be, a BMAP or a Basin Management Action Plan is basically the framework for water quality restoration that basically outlines projects and strategies that are aimed at reducing pollutant loading in order to restore a water body. And these BMAPs are laid out on a 20-year timeline. That's how long it should theoretically take to restore a water body. And the biggest problem with BMAPs right now is that they just don't account for changes in demographics. They don't account for the fact that 1,000 people move to Florida every single day and that we're building up more and we're losing ecosystem services and natural areas. And so one of the task force's recommendations is that BMAPs need to account for those changes. Otherwise, they're destined to fail. And there were a couple of bills over the past couple of legislative sessions that tried to implement that recommendation, but the legislature failed to pass those bills. Another one that is really relevant to this conversation is that the task force actually recommended that DEP should adopt water quality criteria for cyanotoxins, and the state just explicitly declined to do this. Every 3 years, they're required to update their water quality standards in a process called the triennial review, and they just said, no, we're not interested in adopting this standard.
Do you know why, Jen?
They said that it would be duplicative. They said that if they were able to get their nutrient loading under control, then that would take care of the cyanotoxins. Unfortunately, can't seem to get that nutrient loading under control.
Right. Thanks. So Haley, from your perspective, tracking the recommendations of the Blue-Green Algae Task Force and follow through, what unfinished business stands out?
Yeah, I'll piggyback a lot on what Jen just said, but also backing up a little bit further. The purpose of the exercise that Jen, myself, and several other environmental groups, including Friends of the Everglades, have all been engaged on the last couple of months really is, we went through the past legislative sessions following the issuance of that consensus report. And I think as the average Floridian, you're probably watching the news, hearing updates on the legislative session. Bills have been filed with promising language about water quality protections and all of these different areas that the task force has outlined we need to work on. The trick, though, has been watching what actually gets adopted or passed and makes it past the finish line, and when we look at funding priorities as well, we've seen the governor has allocated a lot of money, millions and billions, I think, of dollars towards water quality problems. So what we've been trying to do, and it's been super helpful for me as an activity, to just look at what actually has been happening to implement these recommendations. So like Jen said, most of them, when you come down to it with a simple yes or no, has it been implemented? Most of them, unfortunately, have not been implemented. I was taking account on our draft. It's about 25% of all the recommendations have been implemented, and most of them have been towards issuing more money towards studying and monitoring, but not so much on addressing the source of the pollution, nipping it at the source, right, and stopping it altogether. So to get back to your question, which areas have we most egregiously failed on? I think effectiveness of the programs and regulatory programs we have in place, such as BMAPs and agricultural BMPs. The task force did a good job, in my opinion, of trying to get the department and get our state agencies to hone in on the actual effectiveness of those programs for addressing nutrient pollution. So the demographic changes in BMAPs is a great example that Jen just mentioned. A BMAP won't be effective if within 20 years we've doubled or tripled the population size of that, water basin of that region. So that addressing the effectiveness of the regulatory programs we have in place, I think we're still missing the mark in a lot of the areas there.
So I'm going to pull up another slide now that Waterkeepers Florida put together, and it's a side-by-side comparison of what Senate Bill 712 did, and this was known as the Clean Waterways Act. And I know our audience knows this, but it bears repeating that just because you name something the Clean Waterways Act does not mean that it results in clean waterways. And we have a lot of that kind of naming convention happening in Florida with legislation. So Senate Bill 712 was a piece of legislation in 2020 that was spearheaded by Senator Debbie Mayfield. And you can see pretty clearly here that at least on 4 key recommendations of the Blue-Green Algae Task Force, Senate Bill 712 fell completely short. So in terms of projecting for changing demographics, incorporating those changing demographics into BMAPs, Basin Management Action Plans. This is what Jen was just talking about a few minutes ago. It didn't do that. Also, all agricultural operations receiving a presumption of compliance should implement sampling programs. This was a recommendation of the task force that was not implemented by Senate Bill 712. DEP should develop and implement a septic system inspection and monitoring program. Very low-hanging fruit in Florida. That did not happen. And then finally, adopting numeric thresholds for cyanotoxins. So that is blue-green algae, toxic blue-green algae, and that wasn't done either. So a lot of unfinished business in terms of what the 2020 Clean Waterways Act did. And let me just ask you, Jen, since you provided this helpful slide, has anything substantially changed since 2020 in the Clean Waterways Act on this front?
So nothing from this specific slide has changed. And if you remember, the Clean Waterways Act was a pretty hefty bill. They kind of threw everything in the kitchen sink into that bill in terms of water quality issues. The problem was that it really just paid lip service to the issues without making any tangible changes. It just didn't have any teeth. And so it just didn't address some of the really fundamental issues with our regulatory system. And then to make matters worse, it incorporated a preemption that banned local governments from passing rights of nature regulations. But that's a conversation for a different webinar, I think. But to give credit where credit is due, it did direct DEP to initiate rulemaking in several areas. But the thing that's really important to remember is that when it comes to rulemaking, the devil is in the details when it comes to those rules. You can tell DEP to update the rules, but that could be two very different outcomes based on what the rules say. And since most of those rules are probably going to be subject to legislative ratification, a lot of those changes very well might never see the light of day. So, for example, Senate Bill 712 directed DEP to update rules for things like stormwater and septic systems. And so as a result of that direction, FDEP convened a technical advisory committee for both of those separate areas. And the technical advisory committees had a series of workshops. They issued their own recommendations to DEP to direct that rulemaking. And they did have, again, some good recommendations, just like the task force had some good recommendations. But in this arena, for those of us who have been following that water quality rulemaking, they really missed out on a lot of things that we as environmental advocates felt were really important. And frankly, on some of the things that the task force, the Blue-Green Algae Task Force, had included within their recommendations. So in the world of stormwater rulemaking, they acknowledge that there needs to be an operation and maintenance schedule attached to new permits, which is good. They acknowledge that the rainfall data that was being used was outdated, needed to be updated, and that was good. But at the end of the day, those changes will only apply to new permits. It won't do anything to address the 76,000 plus failing systems that are already in the ground and that are already polluting our waterways. And Senate Bill 712 didn't include a deadline for when these rules needed to be adopted. And for those of us who have been in this arena for a long time, the state actually did this very same exercise back between 2007 and 2010, where they looked at the stormwater rules, they drafted recommendations, they drafted rule amendments, and then they just never got adopted. And so that's something that we're concerned about here, is whether or not these rules are actually ever going to get adopted. And then in the realm of the septic systems, the task force basically said, yes, they need to be designed and maintained properly, but they didn't have any provisions about updating the setbacks, how close septic systems are located to waterways, and they didn't have any recommendations about a regular inspection program. I mean, a lot of these septic systems have been in the ground for decades and never been checked on. So we honestly don't know if they're functioning. And in a lot of places, they don't even know where all the septic systems are. And so that's a huge oversight. The main focus that the Technical Advisory Committee came up with was making sure that new systems going into the ground were enhanced nutrient reduction systems, which that is great. New systems should be enhanced nutrient reduction systems. But if you're not addressing the older failing systems, that's still a net increase in nutrient loading. That doesn't solve the problem. The area where I think there was a little bit of benefit, the only area where they've actually adopted rules, is in the realm of agricultural BMP. So they actually have gotten some rule updates made to that provision of the administrative code, but basically that it got us almost to the finish line, but not quite over it. So FDACS and DEP have made some good progress in making sure that more producers are enrolled in the BMP program. And they updated the rules to make sure that site inspections were happening to ensure that the BMPs were being implemented. The problem is there's a lot of research that shows that BMPs are not as effective at preventing pollution as we had hoped for when they were drafted. And one of the task force's recommendations was that the effectiveness of BMPs needed to be supported by the data. Right now, there's just a presumption of compliance that says if a producer is enrolled in this BMP, if they're doing it, we're going to presume that they're not degrading water quality, but there's not any monitoring to back that up. And so that was where that particular rule fell short, is that there's still not a requirement to go out and ground truth that.
It's a great point. And just for anyone in the audience who's struggling with the alphabet soup, BMPs are best management practices. And that's what gives an agricultural producer, a farmer, a presumption of compliance if they enroll in a best management practices program. And as Jen just stated, we don't have the evidence to show that those BMPs are effective even when they are implemented. So it's a major problem. And I feel like we can't talk much more about blue-green algae in Florida without at least addressing Lake Okeechobee operations, because at least in the case of the St. Lucie and Caloosahatchee estuaries, we know that the massive releases east and west from Lake Okeechobee literally carry blue-green algae down the C-43 and C-44 canals. And those lake operations are governed by the Army Corps of Engineers with input from the South Florida Water Management District. That plays a major role. And just yesterday, we saw a draft of the new LOSUM plan. We're waiting through that, and certainly advocating for a better plan that will result in fewer harmful discharges that cause massive toxic algae blooms. But I just want to address that, even though it's not under the purview of the Blue-Green Algae Task Force per se. It is something we think an awful lot about. Okay, so Gil, I want to turn to you now. You and I have attended some Blue-Green Algae Task Force meetings together. And every time I sit through one of those meetings, whether in person or virtually, I'm struck by the gulf between these really sound recommendations, the bright minds on the task force, and the advice they're giving, and the disconnect between that and the actual implemented policy. So I was hoping you'd talk a little bit about how you see that.
I mean, I'm going to be slightly kinder than I might otherwise be, and frame it in terms of, I mean, yeah, we can't, it would be a significant mistake to try to attribute any blame to achieve the goals of the Blue-Green Algae Task Force by blaming the Blue-Green Algae Task Force itself or its members themselves. They did their job. You know, they were tasked with coming up with these recommendations as to how Florida could tackle this growing problem. And it is a growing problem. The political will to undertake to really solve the problem just doesn't exist. But, you know, you might argue there's a reason for that. And just for example, we were just talking a moment ago about septic system inspections. Okay, this is one of the recommendations of the task force. There should be regular septic system inspections, and there aren't. What happens if there are? Okay, what happens if there are is you're going to find a lot of septic systems that are failing. Okay, we know that. We know that's happening. Okay, if the septic system's failing, it has to be fixed. What does it cost to fix it? And where's that money coming from? Where are those septic systems failing? And I'll just throw out an example, and Eve will know what I'm talking about, but often septic systems are in older neighborhoods, right? Older areas. Septic systems that are liable to fail, and particularly in our neck of the woods, septic systems that are liable to fail in proximity to the water tend to be in older, maybe lower income neighborhoods where people, frankly, can't afford 15 grand, 20 grand, whatever it is to replace their system. Now, there's going to be state money available for this. There's going to be help. But there's a practical reality to saying we need to implement septic system inspections and what that means, you know, and you might argue the same thing in terms of the presumption of compliance for agricultural producers. If we end the presumption of compliance, and I believe that we should, if we end the presumption of compliance and we start testing, and we start finding that certain, you know, operations, or in areas where there are certain operations going on, the water quality has not been improved by these best management practices, we got a problem. What are you going to do about that? Okay, how are we going to pinpoint the source, which is very difficult, you know, in some of these basins. And what are we going to do about it? Which agency is going to have the regulatory authority to actually do something about this? And what can they do? What politically, what will they do given the power of agriculture in Florida, sort of as a player, you know? So the Clean Waterways Act represented the low-hanging fruit, right? It represented, it was the easiest of, you know, the task force recommendations to adopt. So we went for that. The problem is we haven't gone back. The legislature, I mean, there have been attempts, there have been bills filed to adopt all the other suggestions rather than the Blue-Green Algae Task Force. They've gone nowhere. There's absolutely no appetite in the legislature to pursue this. And unfortunately, you know, the cynic in me says it's going to take another crisis. It's going to take another 2018, you know, 2016 before that appetite, you know, comes around, you know, and it's typical. It's like, you know, day late, dollar short. You know, we pretend that that SB Senate 712 solved the problem, and we forget about it. Those of us who work, in this lane know that's not the case. We know it's going to happen again. We know it's going to happen again in part specifically because we didn't adopt the recommendations of the Blue-Green Task Force. Unfortunately, it's going to take another crisis before people go, wow, maybe we should have done that. Yeah, maybe we should have done that,
Yeah, and 2018 was such an unusual crisis in terms of its geographic scope. It included the East Coast, it included the West Coast, and it also included a confluence of red tide, which is different from blue-green algae, but also a harmful algal bloom that resulted in massive die-off of marine life on the West Coast of Florida in particular. So I hear you, Gil. That's my fear too, out of sight, out of mind. But there have been some recent examples of pretty nasty blue-green algae blooms. The picture we showed from the St. Johns River just last September, and then last spring at Pahokee Marina on Lake Okeechobee, there was a really visible noxious bloom that interestingly was kind of the first, at least publicized case of the state deploying quote unquote innovative technologies to douse this bloom. It was kind of like, imagine a group of firefighters going to a 5-alarm fire. These technologies were applied, algicides, things of that nature, to put the bloom out of sight. And we don't know a lot about the unintended consequences of that approach. So Jen, I'm going to turn to you on this one. One area where, at least on paper, the Blue-Green Algae Task Force recommendations have been embraced is on these innovative technologies. The task force recommended in kind of vague terms, embracing them, looking at them, and lo and behold, tens of millions of dollars have been applied from the state budget in recent years, about 10 million or so a year the last 3 years, for these purposes. So what's your read on the lack of monitoring there and how that's been implemented?
I think that we need to be careful with innovative technologies, right? It's just like a fun, buzzy word, like, ooh, innovative and technology, it's new and it's science. But we need to remember that more focus needs to be put on prevention and enforcement, not just remediation, not just cleaning it up after the fact. And to Gil's point earlier, you never let a good crisis go to waste. And so when you have an event like what happened in 2018 with these widespread harmful algal blooms, and then you start throwing money at this problem, you're going to get a lot of people coming out of the woodwork with ways to spend that money with these new and innovative. It reminds me of like the old timey snake oil salesman, like, oh yeah, I've got something that'll cure this. And the technologies that we need to solve these problems don't necessarily need to be new and innovative. A lot of them have existed for a really long time. We need advanced wastewater treatment systems. We need advanced nutrient removing septic systems. So these technologies don't necessarily have to be new and flashy, but they do need to be regulated. They do need to be ground truthed, and they do need to be implemented. And the reason that they're not currently is because they are expensive, like Gil mentioned, and they're not currently required. So we have to think about, is this something that we are willing to spend money on? And I always hear people talk about the cost of the remediation for things like the failing septic systems. Like, oh my gosh, that's going to cost so much money. And yes, it is. But the converse that a lot of people don't talk about is, what is the cost of doing nothing? What is the cost of trying to rebuild or fix an ecosystem after we have broken it? And is it even possible? At some point, you just have to say that we're just throwing money into the water at this point. This isn't going to be something that we can fix. It's the ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? And so, in my opinion, the polluters should be shouldering the cost at the front end. They should be subject to the regulations. They should be bearing the burden of this, not the taxpayers. We shouldn't be throwing citizens' dollars at trying to test these technologies in public waterways and hoping that we don't have some ridiculous unintended consequences. I mean, if you look back for a long time, the kind of classic case of unintended consequences was DDT was used for decades, and it was the standard for an insecticide and for pest control. And then years later, we're seeing all of these health effects, and it's causing cancer in people, and it's driving the bald eagles to the brink of extinction. So we just really need to be mindful that we're pumping the brakes before we're going out there and running to these algae blooms and dumping chemicals on there or blasting them with ultrasonic waves or what have you. There could be some really nasty consequences that we haven't thought through if we're just doing real-time testing in our waterways.
If I can just briefly interject, just to follow up something that Jen said, which is absolutely true. Whatever the cost today of action, if we don't take action today, the cost tomorrow is going to be astronomical, and it's going to be, you run the risk of getting to a situation where we've got no choice, but to shoulder those higher costs, those tougher measures, that sort of thing. It's like pain now or a lot of pain later.
Right. And to give the task force some credit, looking at those specific recommendations under innovative technologies, they do include language for safer, environmentally safe and scalable solutions and preventative methods. I think they have a specific recommendation entirely devoted to, we recommend more go towards prevention technologies. And so I think when the recommendations initially came out and the EP rolled out their grant program for innovative technologies, we initially just saw a lot of these kind of unknown, throw some chemical compound on the problem. We saw a lot of those come out of the woodwork. And I would love to see more of the preventative-minded technologies be part of the solution, because kind of like what you're getting at, Gail, and everyone here on this call, that we're a little too late, that the nutrients are out there. We're going to be seeing pollution in our waterways for decades, right? It's kind of, I compare it to climate change issues. Yes, we need to sequester the carbon. We need to stop the nutrient or clean up the nutrients now. But I think everyone who's environmentally conscious knows it's prevention is what is going to get us out of this mess in the long run.
Right. Well put. I remember sitting and watching the Blue-Green Algae Task Force meet last year in West Palm Beach, and it happened to coincide with a contamination of West Palm Beach's water supply by a blue-green algae toxin. It was cylindrospermopsin, then different than microcystin, which we usually see. And the task force had a really timely, interesting discussion about how we treat these toxins. And they essentially asked for kind of a peer review. I mean, these are all academics on the task force, and peer review of science is very common in their world. There's good reason for it. Seems like a reasonable request, but that has not been embraced. So perhaps the task force will update their recommendations, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we get to that, Haley, I want to ask you, you and Jen and Friends of the Everglades too have been working on a progress report on the Blue-Green Algae Task Force recommendations, and you'll be releasing it soon with other environmental allies. Tell us a little bit about what the progress report will include and what you hope it accomplishes.
Sure. I think I can speak for the group really and say that we hope for accountability, number one, to these recommendations. We intend not to let the water quality issues slide to the wayside during this election year and into the next legislative session. Our group, we intend to continue to be that broken record of environmental organizations that continue to reiterate year after year that water quality is tied to Florida's economy, our way of life. We definitely hope to draw attention to this, keep drawing attention to it. I know it's kind of the backbone of many of our group's missions, right? So this progress report also acknowledges legislation that failed during the last few sessions, legislation and or rules that have or have not been adopted. And so we want to bring attention to those as well, because in some cases there's already pre-drafted, written, and given to the legislature. There are bills out there that could provide some of the solutions here to directly implement some of these recommendations. So I personally hope, this catches the eye of a couple lawmakers who aren't afraid to really dig in on a couple of these issues and continue implementing the recommendations. Like you mentioned, Eve, SB 712 it was this comprehensive big bill, and that was certainly, ambitious to try and get all of this done in one bill. I believe Senator Mayfield at the end, when she deflected some amendments to the bill in its final stages, she did acknowledge, look, this will take more work. I get it. I wanted to get this done this session. So I'm hoping now that some legislators will dig into one or two of those sections, right? Let's look at septic systems. Let's get those private provider or required inspections on septic systems, right? And that's going to be muddy and difficult, and it's going to take someone who's able to bring folks to the table and get it done. There will be some sacrifices needed, but that's my hope for this progress report, is using it to just keep the attention up, on the document, on the recommendations, and really encourage legislators to keep up the work and get some of these passed.
Yeah, thanks, Haley. For lawmakers out there, or people who know lawmakers, have a line to them. If anyone wants to be an honest broker this upcoming session and talk about the real unfinished work of the task force and what we really need to do to prevent another blue-green algae crisis in Florida, there's some very sensible legislation that could be filed, and we'd be happy to work with you, any of our groups, I think. So thanks for that assessment, Haley. Friends of the Everglades will certainly help spread the word about that progress report when it comes out, and really appreciate all the work that you and Jen have done tracking the minutia. I mean, you guys are like foot soldiers in the battle against bureaucracy that can be really mind-numbing, and it's so important though, so thank you. So Gil, I want to turn to you. One of the recommendations in the Blue-Green Algae Task Force consensus document from 3 years ago related to those Lake Okeechobee discharges that I mentioned earlier that can really cause massive blooms and cause them on both sides of the state. And it pointed to the need for more water storage and treatment capacity. This is a perennial issue in Florida. It gets back to restoring the river of grass. That is kind of our core effort at Friends of the Everglades. So how has the state addressed this? And tell us a little bit about some of the problems inherent in the methods so far, Gil.
Well, there is more water storage around Lake O in the works, right? The EAA reservoir south of the lake is work is moving on that. ASR, now we have an opinion on this, but ASR wells north of the lake, aquifer storage and recovery wells, involves more storage. The C43 and the C44 reservoir. So, but the problem is when the Blue-Green Algae Task Force comes out with its report in 2019, it's talking specifically about Lake Okeechobee, Caloosahatchee, and St. Lucie. And it says the task force recommends that siting, design, and funding of this infrastructure, new water storage, be a priority. And so the question is, to what extent has it been a priority? To what extent, since that report came out, has there been a major initiative underway to find, purchase, and begin studying and work on any new storage? And the answer is not really. It hasn't been, there have been projects underway. There have been projects long planned. Water storage is going to increase from what it is right now. Is it going to increase enough to make a significant difference? I think the answer to that is no.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Good. I was going to say the C44 reservoir is designed to address quote unquote local runoff in the watershed, not lake water. And when the C43 on the west side of the lake ultimately comes on, that also will be the intent for that reservoir. And then ASR wells, I know you've gotten kind of a preview of that technology. I mean, there are all kinds of safety concerns that the National Academies of Science have raised in the past. So there are problems with the storage in the works. And just the fourth big one that you mentioned is the EAA reservoir, which is storage without, at least in terms of Friends of the Everglades perspective, adequate treatment to get that water south at federally mandated standards. Right.
Meanwhile, this week, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has come out with the LOSIM, Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual Draft Environmental Impact Statement. And it's dense, and I know you've been devouring this, and I need to do so as well. But right here in the executive summary, this is like the beginning of the report. It's talking about Lake O. Operational changes, while showing some improvements in system-wide performance, cannot achieve water resource goals alone. And it should be noted that more storage, as envisioned by CERT, the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, is needed to realize significant regional improvements. So, everyone, we need more storage. We just do. And there don't seem to be any significant efforts underway to secure it. And once again, that's politically difficult, right? Where's the storage, when you're talking Lake Okeechobee, where's the storage for Lake Okeechobee need to be? South of the lake. Well, what's south of the lake? The Everglades agricultural area. Who's going to part with their land down there? It was hard enough to pry, 16,000 acres for the EAA reservoir, away from the landowners down there. What appetite is there to sell any more land? to the state.
And the EA reservoir is being built on all state-owned lands.
Right.
So yeah, there's that project has been shrunken down significantly, and the ASR wells that are in the works certainly won't be enough to offset toxic discharges. So it's a problem, and it all boils down to the need for more land south of the lake in terms of Lake O discharges. So we do need to have a whole other live stream conversation about that topic, just like the right to clean water issue. So I'll add that to our list. All right, we've got a few more minutes to chat among ourselves, and then we're going to take some questions from our audience. Just a reminder, if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, you can put a question in the comments on either of those platforms, and we'll get to as many as we can before our time is up. All right, so Jen, I want to ask you a related question. It's not directly about the Blue-Green Algae Task Force, but it relates. So Florida Department of Environmental Protection just released an updated list of impaired waters, so waterways not meeting water quality standards. And I'm going to pull up a map here so that we can look at what we're talking about. And for those of you watching and looking at this map, you should know that all of the blue areas represent waters not attaining standards in Florida. And this is almost the entire state of Florida that's in blue. So Jen, I take it that that's not great news.
It is not, in fact, great news. And so something to keep in mind also when you look at this map is that, so the blue sections are the waters that are not attaining standards. Those are the waters that are impaired, is the technical term that we use, but they're not meeting the water quality standards that they're supposed to be meeting. But that's not to say that everywhere else on the map that's not blued out is meeting water quality standards, because there are massive data gaps across the state where the agencies just don't have the bandwidth to do testing. So just because it's not blued out on the map doesn't mean that everything is okay there. It could be one of those reasons, or it could be one of those regions where the state just hasn't been able to do enough testing to determine whether or not an impairment exists. And the problem is that waterways are just becoming polluted faster than our current system is able to restore them. And so it takes a really long time. Once you identify that a water body is impaired or polluted, it takes a really long time to restore it, like we kind of mentioned earlier. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the process, the state will identify that a water body is impaired. They will create something called a TMDL, which stands for total maximum daily load. I usually describe that as a pollution diet. It's how much of a certain pollutant a water bay can assimilate and still restore itself and eventually become clean again. And then they create the BMAP, the Basin Management Action Plan, which is the plan to implement that TMDL, the plan to restore the waterway. But as you can imagine, those are really lofty undertakings. Those things take a lot of time and resources at the state to develop. And so the state is in a situation now where they really need to triage and determine which waterways are the worst of the worst. And those are the waterways that are getting the priorities for TMDL and BMAP development. Meanwhile, you've got other parts of the state where water bodies are impaired that are getting slowly, incrementally worse, that are just low priority because they've got so many other things to deal with. So there's no restoration happening. Meanwhile, those ones are sliding further and further into a polluted state. And so that really is the crux of the problem there, is that the current system is just not keeping up with the amount of pollution that is going into our waterways.
That's the best, clearest explanation I've ever heard of TMDLs and BMAPs. So thank you for that, even though it's incredibly depressing. So I'm going to turn it to Haley for a more positive, inspiring note. Haley, when we talk about these issues, often Floridians or residents of other states even want to know what they can do to help address these water problems, the water crisis we're talking about. So I know you spend a lot of time thinking about that, 1,000 Friends of Florida. What's your take on how Floridians can help be a part of the solution?
Sure. I think it's good. We try to end on a positive note, best that we can. I think my first response to that is join us and call out the problem and share that with your friends, your neighbors, people visiting the state, especially. So if you've got folks from out of town coming to Florida, and perhaps your waterway is looking pretty good on that day, I would bring up the story about how in the summer of 2018 and, in consecutive months and years since then, they haven't looked so great. I think it also depends on where you live in the state, right? water quality issues look a little bit different depending on where you are. And ultimately they lead to the same dirty, nutrient polluted waters, but sometimes it's more or less obvious depending on where you live in Florida. So my answer to that is keep talking about it, share this with your friends, neighbors, family members, especially if you've lived in Florida for a long time. I've, been in this world ever since graduating college, which wasn't too long ago, but I talked to some Floridians who've been living here for 40, 50 years, native Floridians, and they have a very different story about what their spring used to look like, or, what their lake visits were like, with their family back in the day. So those are the stories we need to keep sharing that with your neighbors, with your legislators too. Most importantly, talk to your elected officials in the lead up to the upcoming legislative session. Your state representatives will be holding delegation meetings where they will be looking to hear from their county stakeholders. That's a great opportunity to bring this up. That's my quick answer. Keep talking about it. Don't give up. It's so easy to kind of become discouraged by this, especially if you are an environmental activist yourself. It can be easy to be discouraged, but keep talking about it. Find others who share your passion for it, and amplify your voice when you talk to folks.
Thanks, Haley. So Friends of the Everglades tries to make it easy for people to engage with their lawmakers on legislation and issues. And the good news about what we're talking about today is that we have a roadmap, right? The Blue-Green Algae Task Force really has put together some sound recommendations, and we can ask our lawmakers and apply pressure to lawmakers to embrace those recommendations. So I'll add just one thing to your good points, Haley, and that's that the next Blue-Green Algae Task Force meeting is actually this coming Thursday, August 4th. And you can attend those remotely. Anybody can. It's going to be in Fort Pierce. I think Gil and I are probably going to take a road trip and go in person. But please do, if you have the time and you're interested, please attend. And anyone can make public comment and educate yourself and spread the word. So with that, I think we'll take some questions. And Allie Hartman, our communications director behind the scenes, is going to pull up some questions so that we can address them. Okay, first question is from Eugene Kelly. He asks, how big a contributor are legacy nutrients from agriculture and what potential solutions are there? Jen, do you want to take that one?
Sure, I can take a stab at that one. So we talked about a lot about preventing nutrient inputs, but Eugene makes a really excellent point that there are some legacy nutrients that are already in there and those need to be addressed as well. And so a lot of areas where that's a big problem, they will work on muck dredging projects where they will literally go in and remove the muck that is storing these nutrients from the waterway. And obviously there can be some complications with that, and it's a fairly expensive undertaking. But just to reiterate, the point that we keep trying to make is that you have to stop the loadings in conjunction with the remediation. Like if you walked into your bathroom and the bathtub was overflowing, you would turn off the faucet before you started bailing out the bathtub, right? And so it becomes a very profitable exercise for engineering firms to just keep doing muck dredging if you're not reducing the loading as well.
Interesting. Good question. Thanks, Eugene. We'll take another question. Okay, Eric Jackson asks, besides the septic issue affecting the blue-green algae, do we know in orders of magnitude which other toxic materials affect this crisis the most to the least? So, I mean, phosphorus and nitrogen loading are a huge factor. Jen, anyone? I'll open it up to the group. Whoever would like to take a stab at that one in terms of ranking in orders of magnitude.
Yeah, I'll kick us off and then I can hand it off to Haley and Gil. So Florida is such a varied place from region to region. And just like our ecosystems are different across the state, the pollution sources are very different across the state. And so you've got some areas like in the Spring Shed or like in the Lake Okeechobee region where agriculture is one of the predominant contributors of nitrogen and phosphorus loading. You've got places like barrier islands where septic systems are a really big problem. And then you've got wastewater treatment facilities across the state that could be a problem based on whether they are newer, more effective, advanced wastewater treatment systems, or whether they're older systems. When you think about wastewater treatment systems and older septic systems, they were originally designed to be protective of human health. They were designed to remove pathogens and bacteria. They weren't necessarily so focused on nutrient removal. That's only something that's become a really big problem in the last decade or so. So a lot of that older technology, like, yes, the water's being treated. Yes, it's clean from a perspective that it's not going to make you sick, but it still could be contributing a lot of nutrient loading. So the short answer is it varies from place to place.
Gotcha. And I'll just add one other category, and there are many more we could mention, is biosolids. So biosolids also are a contributor to blue-green algae blooms. They're dumped in certain parts of the state where it becomes the regional culprit, right? To your point, different parts of the state have different major culprits. Anything to add, Haley or Gil, on that front?
This is sort of related to biosolids. Another toxic compound chemical substance, I'd call it a substance, that has come up in the last legislative session and nationally at the EPA is the PFAS, those artificial contaminants that there's hundreds of them. There's a lot of unknowns. We're seeing them in biosolids, human waste material, even in stormwater. It's one of those scary, they're also known as forever chemicals, right? And so I don't want to be doom and gloom right before we end this talk, but that's another one that I think we'll see the state of Florida try to wade into and figure out how we get a handle on these. It's one of those things, kind of like Jen just alluded to with septic systems, when we had the technology for monitoring for pathogens only, or that was our focus, only looking at what we knew was immediately harmful to us. That's what we designed these our regulatory systems around. But now with PFAS coming out, we don't know. We're still figuring out how to monitor. We need to figure out how to clean up, prevent them from getting in the water in the first place. That's another big scary one that might give us nightmares if we get too in depth on, but that's another one to be watching. I know the EPA is adopting water quality standards for PFAS chemicals, and I think the state of Florida is wading into that realm as well.
Come on, Haley, are you saying this isn't an uplifting discussion? Come on. I just want to make one quick point and piggyback on something Jen said, because this goes back to a conversation we had earlier today, talking about septic systems. Even as the state of Florida, even as we're acknowledging that septics are, older septic systems are a problem or a potential problem, we're still building new, we're still installing new septic systems around the state. And these are new, they'll be fine, maybe for a period of time. But after a period of time, maybe they won't be fine. Well, how are we going to know? Well, we're not going to know because we don't have a septic inspection program, So this is like the guy that has heart disease continuing to sit there and smoke cigarettes and say, I don't see the problem,
Yeah. It's incredible that this is more than 50 years after the adoption of the federal Clean Water Act, that we're still grappling with these issues. And there's just evidence that the Clean Water Act itself didn't go far enough in terms of reining in agricultural polluters, non-point source pollution. And on top of that, the Clean Water Act itself is being eroded at the federal level. So also another conversation we can expound upon another day. For now, we'll take another question. EJ Bernier asks, can we revisit eminent domain that was taken out of Senate Bill 10? Okay, so going back, I'll tackle that one. Senate Bill 10 was the enabling legislation in 2017 that led to the EAA reservoir project. And through the process of amendments and the sausage making that led to the passage of that bill, eminent domain, state eminent domain was prohibited in that legislation. So that meant that the state of Florida could only work with willing sellers in the Everglades agricultural area south of the lake or on lands that it already owns. Well, there weren't any willing sellers, so it worked on lands that it already owned. And what we have now is about a 17,000 acre reservoir and stormwater treatment area that's been designed. The stormwater treatment area is under construction. Actually, Gil and I are going to go take a look at the site on Friday. The Army Corps of Engineers is handling the reservoir part, and it's just awarded its first construction contract. 17,000 acres total. Originally, according to the UF Water Institute and other experts, this EAA reservoir project needed to be about 60,000 acres, 60. So we've shrunk it down. The reservoir is going to have 37-foot high embankment walls and water that's an elevation of 23 feet and only about 6,500 acres of stormwater treatment area. So there are legitimate concerns about water quality that will leave the reservoir. Could the reservoir at that depth lead to more creation of blue-green algae is a question that's been asked. So lots of looming questions, and we will be asking them and seeking answers. But yeah, eminent domain to acquire more land was taken out of SB 10 at the state level. Federal eminent domain is still a tool that is on the table. We can take another question. All right. Kent Gross. Hi, Kent. Kent says, not being a local Floridian, how do you overcome big sugar or agriculture's influence on clean water initiatives? Maybe this is a question for another day. I mean, I think it's something we grapple with every day. Who would like to take a stab at that? Gil, you want to?
Oh, sure. We could schedule another webinar. It might take a week, but the big players tend to dominate the arena, right? Big sugar, agriculture in the EAA, multi-billion-dollar operation, and they tend to have a lot of sway in Tallahassee and in Washington, D.C. So, this is kind of the way it is. But I think that organizations like these, that are out there, working in this row. You got to publicize the problems. You got to suggest solutions to the problems. You have to get legislators' ear. You've got to get the public's ear. You have to let the public know what's going on and why it's going on. And that's the only way. You need to sort of build sustained momentum for some of these clean water initiatives, for some of these changes, and just to talk, about some of the issues that we're talking about today. The recommendations of the Blue-Green Algae Task Force, the extent to which testing to see if these BMAX are actually working, that might cost the agriculture industry some money, because if we find out that they're not working, and if we're able to sort of come up with a good guess of where some of this is coming from, and then that requires people to make some changes that cost some money, they're not going to like that, So it's a matter of, I don't want to think that we're only ever going to really do something about these issues when, as I mentioned earlier, it becomes too terrible, too bad to not do anything. You know what I mean? Like, at what point, do you begin to say we have to enact draconian measures on, nutrient runoff? Because if we don't, these waters are going to be destroyed. And that to me seems like a sort of a reasonable, discussion that we ought to be able to have, which is that, look, we understand that the sugar industry, the agricultural industry doesn't want to give on some of these things. But if you don't give now, what are we going to have to give later? And how are we going to continue to push the cost of, cleanup and everything else onto the public? How is it the taxpayers are ultimately going to have to, pay for this? Can taxpayers pay for it? That sort of thing. So, it's a difficult discussion to have, and it's a difficult situation. Like I said, the big players dominate the arena, but I think there needs to be, sustained public pressure to maybe change the conversation a little.
Yep, it looks like we lost Jen for a second. Hopefully she'll be rejoining us. There she is. Hey, Jen. I think, Gil, just to say one thing on your points, the people of Florida are sick and tired of subsidizing industry, big sugar, the phosphate industry, you name it, sick and tired of subsidizing their pollution with our taxpayer dollars. So we've had our eyes open to it. We're tired of it. I think articulating paths to the solution so we can stop paying for that is really important.
Indeed.
Okay, so we have one last question we're going to get to, and then we'll wrap up with some closing comments. Eugene Kelly, by the way, these questions have been great. Thank you all. Would a statewide approach to regulating fertilizer usage be feasible and more effective than the piecemeal approach by local government regulation? Good question. Who wants to take a stab at that one?
I think the answer is probably yes, but I've been thinking about this a lot, fertilizer regulation and what is feasible, what's not. We've seen some good progress on some counties adopting strict ordinances that go beyond, kind of the standard rainy day bans, but some will go a little bit further. Some are tailored to that county's rainfall statistics and patterns, right? So sometimes the tailor-made regulations for a specific county are really useful, right? We've been talking about the diverse regions of the state of Florida, where in some parts of the state, the aquifer is literally like 2 feet, 3 feet. I don't know if that might be an exaggeration, but the aquifer is much closer to the surface level than in other parts of the state. I'm kind of getting in the weeds here. I think the answer is probably yes. Another thing I'd love to see is potentially see FDACs reinstate kind of public reporting and tracking of fertilizer application. That might be a long shot, but we certainly need to get a handle on how it's sold, both personally, commercially, and how it's applied on our lands. Jen, you might have a better answer to that one. Oh,
no, you did a great job with that one. But something to keep in mind is that, yes, a statewide approach might be better, but there has been a trend in the recent years during the legislative sessions to take control away from local governments. Every year, there's like a slew of preemption bills where they're taking away this power. So the state, what I've seen it doing is it'll say, we're going to implement this regulation so that everyone is on a level playing field, but the municipalities aren't allowed to adopt anything more protective than what we have out there. And that's where you start to run into problems.
We want to stay away from that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. The Key West wanted to regulate the size of its cruise ships and was preempted from doing so. So great point, Jen. So we have so much more to follow up on this topic, but we are out of time. I want to say keep an eye out for the progress report that Thousand Friends of Florida, the water keepers across Florida, and now Friends of the Everglades will be joining and releasing in the coming days. Track these groups, stay in touch. We will be watching the next legislative session. I hate to tell you, it's just around the corner in 2023. We'll be pushing for the embracing of the Blue-Green Algae Task Force recommendations that have not been adopted. And I just can't thank you enough, Haley, Jen, Gil, for sharing your insights today. Let's keep this conversation going, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks, everyone who watched.
Thanks all.
Bye.